I mean, call me crazy, but I don't think we should be justifying years of infidelity. And I also don't think that we should be telling people don't go to therapy, get a girlfriend. What's up, gamers? Welcome back to hell. Today I'm going to be doing my May 2021 wrap up. We are getting close to the end of my 2021 recaps. Now, May was my worst reading month so far this year. Usually I do have a little bit of a slump in the summer, and then towards the end of the year in December. That has a lot to do with me being exhausted after probably my busiest semester ever in the spring, and also when a lot of my health problems started really taking a toll in combination with that. So I spent most of the month of May playing Stardew Valley and Animal Crossing and sleeping. In May, I only read 13 books. I did actually have quite a fantastic reading month because the books that I read I did really enjoy. So I ended up having 1 5-star, 6 4-stars, 3 3-stars, and 3 2-stars, with 0 1-star and 0 0-stars. Breaking that down by genre, I ended up reading 3 sci-fi, 3 horror thriller, and 7 fantasy books, which I'll be honest is a lot of fantasy books. 1 in a month where I only read 13 books, and 2 for me in general. I was on kind of a fantasy escapism kick, again because I wasn't really feeling my best, so fantasy ended up really being the savior of my early summer. Starting things off with a bang, the first book I read in May was When No One Is Watching by Alyssa. This is a social thriller about the gentrification of a New York City neighborhood and how over the course of a single week, huge swaths of people who have lived in this neighborhood for decades and decades suddenly mysteriously disappear without a word, and white families start moving in their place. It is also weirdly a romance, which is why it only has 3 stars. I felt like the romance was really out of place in this book. I didn't realize until after I'd finished it that Alyssa is actually a romance writer, and this is her foray into a different genre. And I think she executed that fairly well, but I think that the romance didn't necessarily need to be a part of the story. I enjoyed the book as a whole. I enjoyed the history that it explored and the commentary of gentrification as a whole. And of course, I enjoyed the spooky kind of twists and turns because I'm always a fan of that. I don't know if I'll be picking up anything else that Alyssa writes, just because I did really not love the romance aspect like at all. But I got huge amounts of respect for this book specifically, and I would recommend it if you're looking for a very interesting social thriller. Next, I read Horrid by Katrina Leno, and I ended up giving this 2 stars. I did not really enjoy this book much at all. I didn't actively hate it. I think most 2 stars I do end up ranting quite a bit about them. And this one I didn't despise. I just don't remember anything about it, like at all. Like I feel like I finished the book and then went to do something else, and then within maybe 2 hours the book had been erased from my mind. I found it incredibly forgettable. And while I do vividly remember like the last 2 or 3 pages, like I know exactly how it ends, I don't really know how we got there. If I sit and think about it, I could maybe conjure something up. This book just completely lacked substance. It lacked any kind of suspense. It lacked believable characters. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. It's not a bad book. Again, it just is incredibly forgettable. The basic premise of this book and its beautiful cover is that we have a teen whose dad suddenly passes away, and she and her mom move to her mother's childhood home in Maine, and the house is haunted, and she like is having trouble at school, and then there's stuff that happens. And see, the plot is super generic sounding, and that's probably why I can't think of anything specific about it, because it sounds like I've just described a dozen other YA horror thrillers. This is YA. Could be another reason I really didn't like it. The stakes weren't there, the suspense wasn't there, the horror wasn't there, permanence wasn't there. This just missed the mark for me. My poof is making choices today, and I don't know what they are. Next was was my next attempt to find something a little bit lighthearted, and that was To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo, and I gave this 3 stars. This is a YA fantasy, but it was pitched to me as a little bit of a darker YA fantasy, which is why I picked it up. And I had no idea until I was about a third of the way through the book that this is a Little Mermaid retelling. That totally missed me. Would have found that out if I had like read the back, but I had seen this recommended as like standalone fantasies and I wanted to try and read some of those, so I didn't really look too much into it. I just thought the vibes of it sounded interesting and I wanted to read a mermaid book after enjoying Into the Drowning Deep so much. But that is a long-winded way of saying it was okay. I don't think I would have picked it up if I had known that it was a Little Mermaid retelling, because I don't really like fairy tale retellings. I don't like folk tales. I don't like the folk tale style of fantasy. I've sort of figured that out about myself. The vibes don't hit, but it objectively wasn't bad. I feel like I'm saying that a lot. This book follows the princess of the Sirens, who is this grand assassin of Earth princes. She steals their hearts on her birthday every year, and that's the source of her magic, and her mother's a huge sea bitch. And one day she disobeys her mother and as a result is sentenced to walk on land and shit. She decides then to team up with this prince that she attempted to kill but wasn't able to, in order to take down her mother, the Queen of the Sea, etc. And they fall in love, and there's like adventure and romance and sea and all this kind of stuff. And I really like books that are set on the water. I think the fantasy retelling elements and the romance, I did actually kind of like the romance. This book was just okay. It wasn't mind-blowing, but I did enjoy it. The next book I read was a very surprising 4-star for me, because I didn't really enjoy the first book as much as I wanted to, and that's Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. Now, I did give Vicious 3 stars. I thought it was okay. I didn't really get all the hype, but Vengeful, it was exactly what I wanted. It hit harder, it hit darker, the characters to me were much better written. I loved all the new characters that were introduced, and I also loved the way that the events of the first book were explored in this. And I just think it's very clear that Schwab's writing has improved exponentially between these 2 books. She did write Vicious, then she took a 5 to 7 year break, wrote the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy, and then wrote this book, and I think that really comes through. For those who don't know, the Villains series is about 2 college roommates who are these really intense STEM geniuses who figure out that you can get superpowers if you have a near-death experience and then come back to life. So these 2 roommates devise a series of experiments to give themselves superpowers, and in the process, something really, really bad happens. So our main character, Victor Vale, is jailed for 10 years, and our antagonist, Eli Ever, goes out into the world and crafts a persona for himself as this grand Superman superhero-like character. The book series follows this cat and mouse game of superhero, supervillain from the perspective of the supervillain trying to take each other down. So I highly recommend, even if you weren't super keen on Vicious, that you do pick this one up, or if you're interested in the series, fucking go for it. The next book I read was Where the Forest Meets the Stars by Glendy, Vanderah, and this was a 2-star, potentially going to maybe knock it down to a 1-star. So this book has a really high rating on Goodreads. Everybody I've seen talk about it really, really loves it, and I just thought it was objectively not good in the messaging it sends, which is why I'm waffling on how I want to rate it, because the story itself, I did find myself really enjoying. It's very heartbreaking and heartwarming, but the sort of underlying message of the story and the actions the characters take and the things that they say falls a little bit in line with that Lager Queen of Minnesota problem, where you're saying bad things. The plot of this book is that we have a woman who goes out and rents this cabin in the middle of nowhere to study birds for her graduate research after a traumatic event has taken place in her own life. And one night on her property, she finds a little girl of, I think, 6 to 10, who claims that she is an alien sent down to study humans and witness 5 miracles, and then she will ascend back up to her people. So the entire story is this woman caring for this little alien girl and eventually her neighbor becoming wrapped up in this little found family. And the story is very, very sweet, but there are elements of it that don't really address the problems that are being presented. So a huge part of the neighbor's character is that he has really horrific depression and very, very severe agoraphobia. But the attitude that our main character takes and that everybody around him takes is essentially get over it. Like, you're being a baby, you need to grow up and get over it. And the moral of that then ends up becoming just find somebody to love you. Love cures everything. You'll fall in love and then all your problems will go away. Similarly, there is sort of a background tale that is interwoven into these characters' lives of really horrific infidelity that takes place over a number of years and kind of destroys a family. And again, the attitude of these characters and the moral of everything by the end is, well, it was okay because they were in love. And love is the answer to everything, and love makes everything okay. It justifies all things and will cure you of all ills. And I don't think that's true. Like, I mean, call me crazy, but I don't think we should be justifying years of infidelity with, oh, but they were in love. And I also don't think that we should be telling people don't go to therapy, get a girlfriend. That's why I'm waffling on whether to give this 2 or 1 star, because the story is fine, but the things that happen in the story are not fine. Very, again, similar to The Lager Queen of Minnesota, where the story was fine, but the things that are happening in the story are not fine. Food for thought. The next book I read was thankfully a much better book, and that was These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong, and this was a 4-star read for me. I really, really enjoyed this book. I found it so much fun. It's probably one of the best YA fantasy horrors that I've ever read. I think it definitely falls a little bit more on the mature side of YA, not quite all the way skirting the line between YA and adult, but I still found it extremely enjoyable. So These Violent Delights is a Romeo and Juliet retelling set in 1920s Shanghai that also takes place after the events of the original quote-unquote story and involves a horrible plague that is racking the streets of Shanghai that causes people to violently rip out their throats with their own hands. So this was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed it. I loved the characters. I loved the plot. I do feel like we could have gone a little bit deeper for different elements in it, but this is Chloe Gong's debut, and again, it is YA, so I'm not expecting it to really hit those deep character notes that adult fantasies do sometimes do. And I just really had a really fun time reading it at the end of the day. This is just a fun book, and I'm really excited for the second one, which comes out in November, I think. I've already pre-ordered it. If you haven't picked it up, I'd recommend it. These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. Unfortunately, May continued to be an up and down month, and the next book I read was Persephone Station by Stina Leicht, and this was a 2-star read, and I'm really fucking bummed that this was a 2-star read. In hindsight, I probably should have put this as one of my most disappointing reads of the first half of 2021, because frankly, I had exponentially high expectations for this book. The cover alone is absolutely gorgeous, and the plot sounded fucking phenomenal. So the setup for this book is a Magnificent Seven style crew of space pirate outlaws who are hired on a mission to protect this indigenous society that is under threat of being eliminated by this giant corporation that basically runs the planet that they're all on. And the setup sounds so great. There was a lot of representation in this book. We have main characters who are non-binary, but the writing and the plot itself was just not good. Like, not problematic in any way, but poorly structured and poorly written. This is a standalone sci-fi, so it had the potential to be such an awesome closed story, but unfortunately, I think it did try to do far too much. It's written like it wants to be a series, but not with the structure of something that's being set up to be a series. series. So you'll get these giant info dumps that take up pages and pages where characters are having random flashbacks to describe a single detail. And that sounds similar to the way it's done in a book like Deadly Education, that it was done well in that book, but the major difference is that in this book, those mini stories, flashbacks, whatever you want to call them, will take up like 3 or 4 pages as opposed to a paragraph to provide some context for a detail. Or they will just go on and on and on to the point where you'll start to get invested in this other story only to realize it's just there for world building. It's not necessary at all. And I don't feel like that left enough time for us to actually get to know our characters or to even form any kind of attachment to them. Off the top of my head, I literally can only think of 1 or 2 characters of this entire group of outlaws that's hired to do this job. In my head, I don't even remember, much less their names, but even what their jobs were on this team. Literally, I just remember like the main character and the main character's best friend. And this is a fairly substantial book at 500-ish pages, which I recognize may not necessarily be super long for a standalone sci-fi, but for it to have attempted to cover so much, there's very little here, and that was a huge disappointment. So unfortunately, I would not recommend picking this up. At this point, the only reason it's on my shelf up here is because I think the cover is gorgeous. But yeah, thankfully after that, I ended up having a series of really, really excellent books to end the month of May. And the first of those really, really excellent books was Finlay Donovan is Killing It by Elle Cosimano. I give this book 4 stars. I thought this was hilarious. This was such a fun mystery thriller. I don't know if it's a cozy mystery because I'm not super well versed in that subgenre, but it certainly had me giggling even though it was about horrible crimes well into the night. I think I finished this all in one sitting and ended up finally going to bed at like 2 a.m., which I really don't do. I'm a huge fan of going to bed early. I really, really loved this book. This is, again, mystery thriller about our main character, Finlay Donovan, who is a writer. She is really down on her luck. She's recently gone through a divorce. Her ex-husband is a raging asshole, and she can't seem to come up with something to meet her next deadline. So she meets with her agent in a Panera Bread. Over the course of this conversation, somebody at the table next to her overhears and gets the horrifically wrong impression that Finlay Donovan is none other than a hired hitwoman. So she leaves her name and number, and shit happens from there. Again, this book was so much fun to read. It was really funny, really entertaining. You love Finlay and our secondary main character who comes in a little bit later in the novel, so I'm not going to name any names, no spoilers. You just can't help but love them so much and want to root for them from their very first appearances. And the mystery elements are really, really well done. The thriller elements are really, really well done. And I genuinely found myself questioning what was going to happen from one page to the next, and not in a this was set up poorly kind of way, but in a it was set up really well, and by the end you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that coming? Which was super fun. I just love that. I love a mystery that's well done and also keeps me on my toes. I highly, highly recommend this book. Again, I gave this 4 stars, and if you're looking for a super, super fun mystery thriller that's dark but not depressing, I would definitely go with this one. Returning back to fantasy, which you'll now see it started my fantasy kick, I read Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, and I give this 4 stars. I really, really, really enjoyed this. I thought it was hilarious. I really loved our main character and our hero. I thought they were so interesting, and I liked the way that Naomi Novik really subverted the tropes that you go into this book kind of expecting it to adhere to. I didn't really realize that it was playing off Harry Potter until I was about a quarter of the way through the book when some of these terms started flying around. I mentioned in another video, I think my September TBR, that I didn't grow up with Harry Potter. I've never read the books. That is to say that a lot of the things that I think people found repetitive in this book did not seem so to me because I wasn't familiar with some of these tropes. I wasn't familiar with the setup as much, and I found that I really did kind of enjoy the dark magical school peril thing, and I liked that our character was kind of an emo bitch. I thought that was really endearing, and specifically I liked the writing style of this book. I thought it was really, really funny, and I liked the way that Novik was able to build a a world in such an incredibly short book through the use of a much, much more refined version of what I absolutely hated in Persephone Station. And that is giving you hints about things, giving you histories of things, but not taking up too much of your time to do so, giving you just enough information to understand, but not enough information to make you feel like it was not worth your time. I really did end up enjoying this. It was a super, super fun read, kind of the exact thing that I needed at that moment, and I'm excited for the next book that comes out in October or November, I think. I pre-ordered it, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. Carrying on with my darker fantasy kick, I read Lore by Alexandra Bracken. I gave this 4 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. Personally, I would qualify this as a younger adult fantasy, not an older YA fantasy. That's just me. I think this is a book that kind of skirts the line a little bit because there are a lot of really, really dark things in it, and that made the book more appealing to me as somebody that likes books that are a little bit darker sometimes. This is a standalone. The basic premise of this book is that millennia ago, the Greek gods, first of all, are like legit, they're real, and they were cursed to come down to Earth once every 7 years and let humans attempt to kill them in order to get their divine powers as punishment for this thing that these gods had done. And so throughout the many, many years since then, these different families and legacies have formed entirely around this every 7 years murder free-for-all, trying to kill the gods and claim their power for their own. We follow Lore, who is the last remaining member of her family, her clan, during one of these murder free-for-alls, and it hits the ground running really, really fast, which I really enjoyed, and that was probably one of the reasons I really, really did love this so much, is that it's incredibly fast-paced. So she is the last remaining member of her family, and she decides that she doesn't want any part of it until she is inadvertently roped into the battle royale by forces beyond her control. Like I said, super fast-paced, super high-octane, really, really fun, dark fantasy. Definitely worth your time to pick up if you're interested in a darker standalone fantasy. And finally, the last books I read in May were the entire Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. 3 stars for City of Brass, Mother of God. And I gave these books 3 stars for the City of Brass, 4 stars for the Kingdom of Copper, and 5 stars for the Empire of Gold, respectively. Gonna put these down before I drop them again. And I loved this series. I really, really loved it. I mentioned this, I think, in my mid-year freakout tag, that I do think that Empire of Gold specifically is the best fantasy conclusion I have ever read in my entire life, and I have yet to read a fantasy conclusion that even comes close. I can't really say anything about it at all because it is the 3rd book in a huge, huge political fantasy series, but I do have a couple of comments about the series as a whole. So the first book, City of Brass, and kind of long-term the series as a whole, follows our main character Nari, who is attacked one night in the back streets of Cairo, and in the process accidentally summons an ancient jinn warrior. And so the two of them go on this mystical journey to figure out why Nari could do that, those answers they will be able to find at this grand city of Daevabad, where all these magical creatures are basically living and have been sequestered off from humanity. The first book, City of Brass, is their journey. This book does feel incredibly YA. This is my deep state conspiracy theory. There's a huge tonal shift that happens between the City of Brass and the Kingdom of Copper. Like, it almost feels like this is the start of a series and that the idea was continued in Kingdom of Copper with a slightly different editor, but this book feels very YA, and the other 2 books, Kingdom of Copper, Empire of Gold, feel very, very adult. They're much darker, the world is a lot bigger, major conflict that's in the first book is almost entirely removed from the second and third books, and the things that make this series so goddamn exceptional are almost all entirely in Kingdom of Copper and Empire of Gold. So my theory is, especially because these books are typically shelved both in YA and adult, at least in my Barnes & Noble, is that the editor wanted these books to have a broad appeal across age groups, and that this book was originally a lot darker. That's my theory. That's not to say I didn't enjoy this. Clearly I enjoyed it enough to continue off the series, but it just feels like a different book. It's very weird. It's very odd. But the things, again, again, that make this series utterly exceptional are in the subsequent books. If you enjoy City of Brass but don't know whether you want to continue on, I highly recommend continuing on, because what is essentially a hero's journey, coming of age kind of story in City of Brass becomes a huge, super intricate, super complicated, super dark military political fantasy a la, I hate to say Game of Thrones, I'll just die, interwoven tapestry of incredible political fantasy. We're following a lot of different characters with a lot of different motivations, and it really doesn't feel anything like the first book. I don't know, that's just my 2 cents. I did obviously love this series. I can't stop talking about it, can't stop recommending it to people, and I think I've figured out that I do like fantasy. I just don't like medieval Western Europe fantasy for some reason. I'm over it, I guess, but I never really got into it in the first place. I don't know. That is the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. Again, highly recommend this. I really loved this series. Amazing and unparalleled, and I want every other series that I read ever to make me feel the way that Empire of Gold made me feel. And that was it. That was all the books I read in May. That was all 13 of them. Again, not my best reading month in terms of quantity, but if we're breaking things down by how many books I read versus how many books I really enjoyed, I think this actually did end up being a really excellent reading month. I'm glad I got to read all these really cool books. It was fun. I enjoyed reading all the fantasy, something a little bit different. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these books down below, or if you have any suggestions for more fantasies that I should check out. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, gamers. Smash that like button, hit that bell. You know the drill, gamers. And remember, I love you.